Welcome back. Let's reading some more. So this will take many weeks and months to read about United States. That's in a 30-degree hot apartment. So we need some water. Need a little water many times because it's very hot in my apartment. I don't like to do this my whole day. I like to do something else later today. I think I'd like to drive a American Truck Simulator. But let's read a bit more. Yes, I need half a minute.
History of New York State. This article is about the history of the state of New York. For a history of the city, see History of New York City. For the book by Washington Irving, see A History of New York. New York history redirects here. Not to be confused with New York History, a publication of the Fenimore Art Museum. The history of New York begins around 10,000 BC when the first people arrived. By 1100 AD, two main cultures had become dominant as the Iroquoian and Algonquian developed. European discovery of New York was led by Giovanni the Verrazzano in 1524, followed by the first land claim in 1609 by the Dutch. As part of New Netherland, the colony was important in the fur trade and eventually became an agricultural resource thanks to the patroon system. In 1626, the Dutch thought they had bought the island of Manhattan from Native Americans. In 1664, England renamed the colony New York, after the Duke of York and Albany, brother of King Charles II. New York City gained prominence in the 18th century as a major trading port in the 13 colonies. New York played a pivotal role during the American Revolution and subsequent war. The Stamp Act Congress in 1765 brought together representatives from across the 13 colonies to form a unified response to British policies. The Sons of Liberty were active in New York City to challenge British authority. After a major loss at the Battle of Long Island, the Continental Army suffered a series of additional defeats that forced a retreat from the New York City area, leaving the strategic port and harbor to the British Army and Navy as their North American base of operations for the rest of the war. The Battle of Saratoga was the turning point of the war in favor of the Americans, convincing France to formally ally with them. New York's Constitution was adopted in 1777, and strongly influenced the United States Constitution. New York City was the national capital at various times between 1788 and 1790, where the Bill of Rights was drafted. Albany became the permanent state capital in 1797. In 1787, New York became the 11th state to ratify the United States Constitution. New York hosted significant transportation advancements in the 19th century, including the first steamboat line in 1807, the Erie Canal in 1825, and America's first regularly scheduled rail service in 1831. These advancements led to the expanded settlement of western New York and trade ties to the Midwest settlements around the Great Lakes. Due to New York City's trade ties to the South, there were numerous Southern sympathizers in the early days of the American Civil War and the mayor-proposed secession. Far from any of the battles, New York ultimately sent the most soldiers and money to support the Union cause. Thereafter, the state helped create the industrial age and consequently was home to some of the first labor unions. During the 19th century, New York City became the main entry point for European immigrants to the United States, beginning with a wave of Irish during their Great Famine. Millions came through Castle Clinton in Battery Park before Ellis Island opened in 1892 to welcome millions more, increasingly from Eastern and Southern Europe. The Statue of Liberty opened in 1886 and became a symbol of hope. New York boomed during the Roaring Twenties, before the Wall Street crash of 1929, and skyscrapers expressed the energy of the city. New York City was the site of successive tallest buildings in the world from 1913 to 1974. The build-up of defense industries for World War II turned around the state's economy from the Great Depression, as hundreds of thousands worked to defeat the Axis powers. Following the war, the state experienced significant suburbanization around all the major cities, and most central cities shrank. The thruway system opened in 1956, signaling another era of transportation advances. Following a period of near bankruptcy in the late 1970s, New York City renewed its stature as a cultural center, attracted more immigration, and hosted the development of new music styles. The city developed from publishing to become a media capital over the second half of the 20th century, hosting most national news channels and broadcasts. Some of its newspapers became nationally and globally renowned. The state's manufacturing base eroded with the restructuring of industry, and the state transitioned into service industries. Prehistory, edit. See also, Lenape and Indigenous Peoples of New York, State. The first peoples of New York are estimated to have arrived around 10,000 BC. Around AD 800, Iroquois ancestors moved into the area from the Appalachian region. The people of the Point Peninsula complex were the predecessors of the Algonquian peoples of New York. By around 1100, the distinct Iroquoian-speaking and Algonquian-speaking cultures that would eventually be encountered by Europeans had developed. The Five Nations of the Iroquois League developed a powerful confederacy about the 15th century that controlled territory throughout present-day New York, into Pennsylvania around the Great Lakes. For centuries, the Mohawk cultivated maize fields in the lowlands of the Mohawk River, which were later taken over by Dutch settlers at Schenectady, New York when they bought this territory. The Iroquois nations to the west also had well-cultivated areas and orchards. The Iroquois established dominance over the fur trade throughout their territory, bargaining with European colonists. Other New York tribes were more subject to either European destruction or assimilation within the Iroquoian Confederacy. Situated at major native trade routes in the northeast and positioned between French and English zones of settlement, the Iroquois were intensely caught up with the onrush of Europeans, which is also to say that the settlers, whether Dutch, French or English, were caught up with the Iroquois as well. Algonquian tribes were less united among their tribes. They typically lived along rivers, streams, or the Atlantic coast. But both groups of natives were well-established peoples with highly sophisticated cultural systems. These were little understood or appreciated by the European colonists who encountered them. The natives had a complex and elaborate native economy that included hunting, gathering, manufacturing, and farming, and were a mosaic of Native American tribes, nations, languages, and political associations. The Iroquois usually met at an Onondaga in northern New York, which changed every century or so, where they would coordinate policies on how to deal with Europeans and strengthen the bond between the five nations. Tribes who have managed to call New York home have been the Iroquois, Mohawk, Mohican, Susquehannock, Pechan, Kinaton, Ontario and Nanticoke. Pre-colonial period, edit. In 1524, Giovanni the Verrazzano, an Italian explorer in the service of the French crown, explored the Atlantic coast of North America between the Carolinas and Newfoundland, including New York Harbor and Narragansett Bay. On the 17th of April, 1524, Verrazzano entered New York Bay, by way of the strait now called the Narrows. He described a vast coastline with a deep delta in which every kind of ship could pass, and he adds that it extends inland for a league and opens up to form a beautiful lake. This vast sheet of water swarmed with native boats. He landed on the tip of Manhattan and perhaps on the furthest point of Long Island. In 1535, Jacques Cartier, a French explorer, became the first European to describe and map the St. Lawrence River from the Atlantic Ocean, sailing as far upriver as the site of Montreal. Dutch and British colonial period, edit. Main article, New Netherland. On the 4th of April, 1609, Henry Hudson, in the employ of the Dutch East India Company, departed Amsterdam in command of the ship Half Main, Half Moon. On September the 3rd he reached the estuary of the Hudson River. He sailed up the Hudson River to about Albany near the confluence of the Mohawk River and the Hudson. His voyage was used to establish Dutch claims to the region and to the fur trade that prospered there. After a trading post was established at Albany in 1614. In 1614, the Dutch under the command of Hendrik Christiansen, built Fort Nassau, now Albany, the first Dutch settlement in North America and the first European settlement in what would become New York. It was replaced by nearby Fort Orange in 1624. In 1625, Fort Amsterdam was built on the southern tip of Manhattan Island to defend the Hudson River. This settlement grew to become the city New Amsterdam. The British conquered New Netherland in 1664. Lenient terms of surrender most likely kept local resistance to a minimum. The colony and New Amsterdam were both renamed New York, and Beverwijk was renamed Albany, after its new proprietor, James II, later King of England, Ireland and Scotland, who was at the time Duke of York and Duke of Albany. The population of New Netherland at the time of English takeover was 7,000,080,000. Province of New York, 1,664 1,776, edit. Main article, Province of New York. Thousands of poor German farmers, chiefly from the Palatine region of Germany, migrated to upstate districts after 1700. They kept to themselves, married their own, spoke German, attended Lutheran churches, and retained their own customs and foods. They emphasized farm ownership. Some mastered English to become conversant with local legal and business opportunities. They ignored the Indians and tolerated slavery, although few were rich enough to own a slave. Large manors were developed along the Hudson River by elite colonists during the 18th century, including Livingston, Cortlandt, Phillipsburg, and Rensselaerswyck. The manors represented more than half of the colony's undeveloped land. The province of New York thrived during this time, its economy strengthened by Long Island and Hudson Valley agriculture, in conjunction with trade and artisanal activity at the port of New York. The colony was a bready biscuit and lumber yard for the British sugar colonies in the Caribbean. New York's population grew substantially during this century, from the first colonial census, 1698, to the last, 1771. The province grew ninefold, from 18,067 to 168,007. New York in the American Revolution, edit. Further information, John Petersinger, Stamp Act Congress, Invasion of Canada, 1775, New York and New Jersey Campaign, Prisoners of War in the American Revolutionary War, and Intelligence in the American Revolutionary War. New York played a pivotal role in the Revolutionary War. The colony verged on revolt following the Stamp Act of 1765, advancing the New York City-based Sons of Liberty to the forefront of New York politics. The act exacerbated the depression the province experienced after unsuccessfully invading Canada in 1760. Even though New York City merchants lost out on lucrative military contracts, the group sought common ground between the king and the people. However, compromise became impossible as of April 1775 battles of Lexington and Concord. In that aftermath, the New York Provincial Congress on the 9th of June 1775, for £5 for each hundredweight of gunpowder delivered to each county's committee. Two powerful families had for decades assembled colony-wide coalitions of supporters. With few exceptions, members long associated with the Delancey faction went along when its leadership decided to support the crown, while members of the Livingston faction became patriots. New York's strategic central location and port made it key to controlling the colonies. The British assembled the century's largest fleet. At one point 30,000 British sailors and soldiers anchored off Staten Island. General George Washington barely escaped New York City with his army in November 1776. General Sir William Howe was successful in driving Washington out, but erred by expanding into New Jersey. By January 1777, he retained only a few outposts near New York City. The British held the city for the duration, using it as a base for expeditions against other targets. In October 1777, American General Horatio Gates won the Battle of Saratoga, later regarded as the war's turning point. Had Gates not held, the rebellion might well have broken down. Losing Saratoga would have cost the entire Hudson-Champlain corridor, which would have separated New England from the rest of the colonies and split the future Union. Statehood to the Civil War, edit. The Stadhuis in Albany became the state's seat of government when Albany became the permanent capital in 1797. Upon war's end, New York's borders became well defined. The counties east of Lake Champlain became Vermont and the state's western borders were settled by 1786. Many Iroquois supported the British, typically fearing future American ambitions. Many were killed during the war, others went into exile with the British. Those remaining lived on 12 reservations. By 1826 only 8 reservations remained, all of which survived into the 21st century. The state adopted its constitution in April 1777, creating a strong executive and strict separation of powers. It strongly influenced the federal constitution a decade later. Debate over the federal constitution in 1787 led to formation of the groups known as Federalists, mainly downstaters, those who lived in or near New York City, who supported a strong national government, and anti-federalists, mainly upstaters. those who lived to the city's north and west, who opposed large national institutions. In 1787, Alexander Hamilton, a leading Federalist from New York and signatory to the Constitution, wrote the first essay of the Federalist Papers. He published and wrote most of the series in New York City newspapers in support of the proposed United States Constitution. Anti-Federalists were not swayed by the arguments, but the state ratified it in 1788. In 1785, New York City became the national capital and continued as such on and off until 1790. George Washington was inaugurated as the first President of the United States in front of Federal Hall in 1789. The United States Bill of Rights was drafted there, and the United States Supreme Court sat for the first time. From statehood to 1797, the legislature frequently moved the state capital between Albany, Kingston, Poughkeepsie, and New York City. Thereafter, Albany retained that role. In the early 19th century, New York became a center for advancement in transportation. In 1807, Robert Fulton initiated a steamboat line from New York to Albany, the first successful enterprise of its kind. By 1815, Albany was the state's turnpike center, which established the city as the hub for pioneers migrating west to Buffalo and the Michigan Territory. In 1825 the Erie Canal opened, securing the state's economic dominance. Its impact was enormous, one source stated, linking the Atlantic Ocean and the Great Lakes. The canal was an act of political will that joined the regions of the state, created a vast economic hinterland for New York City, and established a ready market for agricultural products from the state's interior. In that year western New York transitioned from frontier to settled area. By this time, all counties and most municipalities had incorporated, approximately matching the states is organized today. In 1831, the Mohawk and Hudson Railroad started the country's first successful regularly scheduled steam railroad service. Advancing transportation quickly led to settlement of the fertile Mohawk and Genesee valleys and the Niagara frontier. Buffalo and Rochester became boom towns. Significant migration of New England Yankees, mainly of English descent, to the central and western parts of the state led to minor conflicts with the more settled Yorkers, mainly of German, Dutch, and Scottish descent. More than 15% of the state's 1850 population had been born in New England. The western part of the state grew fastest at this time. By 1840, New York was home to 7 of the nation's 30 largest cities. During this period, towns established academies for education, including for girls. The western area of the state was a center of progressive causes, including support of abolitionism, temperance, and women's rights. Religious enthusiasms flourished and the Latter-day Saint movement was founded in the area by Joseph Smith and his vision. Some supporters of abolition participated in the Underground Railroad, helping fugitive slaves reach freedom in Canada or in New York. In addition, in the early 1840s the state legislature and Governor William H. Seward expanded rights for free blacks and fugitive slaves in New York. In 1840 the legislature passed laws protecting the rights of African Americans against Southern slave catchers. One guaranteed alleged fugitive slaves the right of a jury trial in New York to establish whether they were slaves, and another pledged the aid of the state to recover free blacks kidnapped into slavery, as happened to Solomon Northup of Saratoga Springs in 1841, who did not regain freedom until 1853. In 1841 Seward signed legislation to repeal a 9-month law that allowed slaveholders to bring their slaves into the state for a period of 9 months before they were considered free. After this, slaves brought to the state were immediately considered freed, as was the case in some other free states. Sword also signed legislation to establish public education for all children, leaving it up to local jurisdictions as to how that would be supplied. Some had segregated schools. New York culture bloomed in the first half of the 19th century. In 1809, Washington Irving wrote the satirical A History of New York under the pen name Diedrich Knickerbocker, and in 1819 he based Rip Van Winkle and the Legend of Sleepy Hollow in Hudson Valley towns. Thomas Cole's Hudson River School was established in the 1830s by showcasing dramatic landscapes of the Hudson Valley. The first baseball teams formed in New York City in the 1840s, including the New York Knickerbockers. Professional baseball later located its Hall of Fame in Cooperstown. Saratoga Race Course, an annual summer attraction in Saratoga Springs, opened in 1847. New York in the American Civil War, edit. Main article, New York in the American Civil War. A civil war was not in the best interest of business, because New York had strong ties to the Deep South, both through the port of New York and manufacture of cotton goods in upstate textile mills. Half of New York City's exports were related to cotton before the war. Southern businessmen so frequently traveled to the city that they established favorite hotels and restaurants. Trade was based on moving Southern goods. The city's large Democrat community feared the impact of Abraham Lincoln's election in 1860, and the mayor urged secession of New York. By the time of the 1861 Battle of Fort Sumter, such political differences decreased and the state quickly met Lincoln's request for soldiers and supplies. More soldiers fought from New York than any other northern state. While no battles were waged in New York, the state was not immune to Confederate conspiracies, including one to burn various New York cities and another to invade the state via Canada. In January 1863, Lincoln issued the Emancipation Proclamation, which freed the slaves in states that were still in rebellion against the Union. In March 1863, the federal draft law was changed so that male citizens between 20 and 35 and unmarried citizens to age 45 were subject to conscription. Those who could afford to hire a substitute or pay $300 were exempt. Anti-war newspaper editors attacked the law, and many immigrants and their descendants resented being drafted in place of people who could buy their way out. Democratic Party leaders raised the specter of a deluge of freed Southern blacks competing with the white working class, then dominated by ethnic Irish and immigrants. On the lottery's first day, the 11th of July, 1863, the first lottery draw was held. On Monday, the 13th of July, 1863, 5 days of large-scale riots began, which were dominated by ethnic Irish, who targeted blacks in the city, their neighborhoods, and known abolitionist sympathizers. As a result, many blacks left Manhattan permanently, moving to Brooklyn or other areas. End of the Civil War to 1901, edit. In the following decades, New York strengthened its dominance of the financial and banking industries. Manufacturing continued to rise. Eastman Kodak, founded in 1888 in Rochester, General Electric in Schenectady, and Endicott Johnson Shoe Company in the Triple Cities are some of the well-known companies founded during this period. Buffalo and Niagara Falls attracted numerous factories following the advent of hydroelectric power in the area. With industry blooming, workers began to unite in New York as early as the 1820s. By 1882, the Knights of Labor in New York City had 60,000 members. Trade unions used political influence to limit working hours as early as 1867. At the same time, New York's agricultural output peaked. Focus changed from crop-based to dairy-based agriculture. The cheese industry became established in the Mohawk Valley. By 1881, the state had more than 241,000 farms. In the same period, the area around New York Harbor became the world's oyster capital, retaining that title into the early 20th century. Duration, 3 minutes and 31 seconds. Scenes showing immigrants arriving at the immigration depot at Ellis Island in 19